via Zoom, obviously. But good news, exciting news, as I rabbit on to let the participant number go up. The Frontline Club will be reopening on the 20th. That's a Tuesday. So if you're in the London area, get down there. Tom will be sharing with us later how the Frontline Club intervened in his career and helped produce his book, Kleptopia, which we're also going to be talking about. There it is, Kleptopia, available in all good bookshops. Look, I'm very on brand. Misha can also talk about this one. I couldn't find any more recent books, I'm afraid, though I do have them. They're just, I think, upstairs. So Kleptoscope is an event to discuss all things related to dirty money. We started doing them at the club back in 2015 when it looked like the direction of progress was in rather more positive than it looks now. It seems quite a long time ago. But, there we go. Feeling very excited about the panel today. I want to introduce them to you briefly before they enlighten us about what is wrong with London, why London is so often implicated in big money laundering scandals, and what we need to do about that. Tom Burgis works as an investigations correspondent at the Financial Times and is the author of Kleptopia, which the Washington Post says is a must read. I'm about halfway through, but so far it's good. And I've got high hopes for the second half. Anneliese Dodds is a Labour Party member of Parliament for Oxford East and has been since 2017, am I right? And Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, importantly for our purposes. And also importantly for our purposes, has a good track record on saying the right things about kleptocracy and taking it as seriously as it deserves to be taken, which is very reassuring. And Misha Glenny is author of half a dozen books on Eastern Europe and financial crime, including McMafia, which became the smash hit BBC television series, and That Is My Dog. He is also a member of the advisory board of Global Witness. We have about an hour to talk. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. But I'm going to kick off by talking about the FinCEN files. I'm sure many of you saw the series of stories by BuzzFeed News and the ICIJ, in which the US Treasury was revealed as to have remarked the UK is a higher risk jurisdiction for shell companies and money laundering, which came as more of a surprise to people in Britain than it perhaps should have done. Anneliese, could we start with you? Why is the UK a high risk jurisdiction, according to the US Treasury? What does that mean, and how worried should we be about that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and your dog, for that question. And just first want to say what a privilege it is to be part of this panel with, people whose work I respect a huge amount. And I think the role of journalists has been absolutely crucial, very obviously, in uncovering some of the nefarious acts and activities that are very sadly rooted through the City of London. So it really is just terrific to be with you tonight. I have to say, I unfortunately wasn't particularly surprised to see that designation being used about London, unfortunately. I mean, we've seen over the years so many different exposés of how a whole variety of different features actually of our financial system have been used to hide illicit wealth and facilitate also tax avoidance in many cases as well. Not often they go together, as we know, whether we're talking about company structures, we're talking about the extremely lax system around company formation in the UK, the role of company formation agents, and the role of UK property, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about as well, our overall legislative context and the kind of debacle that we've had around failure to prevent economic crime and so forth. So unfortunately, it wasn't a huge surprise. I suppose the most frustrating thing often I think about this is that, of course, the reason why very often the UK is used is the image of our country, which is as one where contracts are kept to, where there is a clean legal system, where there's robustness and trust in the system, and yet it is being undermined, and it's being undermined in a way that obviously is extremely bad for those people who've been at the rough end of the behaviour of some of the individuals who are profiting from this. But it's also, of course, being undermined in a way that's very bad for lots of British businesses as well. So I think we always need to look at it in that context, because sometimes I hear people claiming, well, this is about keeping, the schoolgirl error there, keeping the UK as a business-friendly jurisdiction. Well, actually the kinds of things that people on this call have been writing about are not friendly to business. They're directly undercutting decent businesses.
So, of the journalists that you mentioned who have been doing such great work, obviously we have two of them with us. Let's start with Misha, who probably has been writing about this longer than most. I think, I mean, you actually, like Tom and me, Misha, been written a lot about corruption in Eastern Europe. At what point did you realise that London was as much part of the problem as Eastern Europe was?
Well, it was when I started writing McMafia, and what interested me about McMafia was, first of all, the collapse of the rule of law and the emergence of oligarchies supported by organized crime and either serving or former intelligence agents. But I looked at the strands of that organized crime, both in terms of what they were doing with the illicit goods and services that they were purveying, and you couldn't help but notice straight away that the main markets that they were sending cocaine or trafficking women for sexual purposes or selling untaxed cigarettes into were the United States and the European Union. And the European Union, of course, by this time in the 1990s, was a huge, huge market. So the question then led me to, well, what are they doing with the money? And what it was that they were suddenly very cash rich in jurisdictions which were politically unstable, like Russia. So, for example, if we take Russia and the emergence of the oligarchy who were seizing state assets left, right, and center and trying to liquidate those assets, just as was happening in the former Yugoslavia, using the war as a sort of cover, they were aware of the instability of their countries, and they also knew that these sort of uncertain times would not last forever. So they placed a particular emphasis on getting the money out of Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union and finding safe havens. And this is when they discovered that globalization, as it was emerging during the 80s and 90s, had adapted existing institutions, particularly such venerable institutions as tax havens, which were really set up in the 17th and 18th centuries. What they realized was that globalizing companies in the West were already using lots of these facilities to their tax advantage, and that it was very easy to do so. And they had set up mechanisms which anyone could join in on. And so what they did was to identify a vulnerability, a weakness that was inherent in the way that financial capitalism in particular had developed in the 80s and 90s. And they just started using it. So I realized that what was happening was that it wasn't merely that they were engaged in nefarious activity, but they had these ready-made structures that Western corporations were using to their advantage that they too could exploit. And one of the problems with that is that it becomes extremely difficult to tell what money is criminal, what comes from political corruption, what comes from tax evasion, which is absolutely critical to this whole thing, because that's why these institutions are there in the first place. For the first sort of 10, 15 years after the collapse of communism, very few people, if anyone, was investigating this. In fact, and I'll finish with this in my opening remarks, because London and New York were engaged in a race to become the financial center in the world, what they were doing was deregulating at speed, so that they were positively encouraging phenomena that you mentioned in the introduction in particular, which was using London property and other property in the United Kingdom and in New York and Los Angeles and Florida as a way to attract money from all over the world, and they simply didn't care whether its origins were dubious, criminal, corrupt, or whatever.
I remember when I first read McMafia, I suppose I felt that what you were writing about was so appalling that quite clearly it had to be over by the time you'd written the book, right? Because there was no way that anyone could know about this and for this still to be going on. But one of the amazing things about Kleptopia is it's like a sequel, right? You know, it's saying, you know, it's still going on, and it's, you know.
Well, I would say, Ollie, about that when I read Kleptopia, and I read it in proof form, I thought this is basically, and it's similar to Moneyland. This is basically McMafia, the new generation. And you know, I'm glad that you and Tom are in a position to do this, because I'm too old and tired and sick and stupid to do it now. But the point is that the generation of people who are producing books about it now are going into much more granular detail than I was able to do, and particularly looking at the money laundering aspects. And so, you know, from 2004, 2005 onwards, there is now no excuse for democratic political elites to say, we had no idea that this was going on. We have chapter and verse now in extraordinary detail from the early 2000s onwards, and things like Kleptopia really spell it out, so that everyone now has the tools and the instruments to demand and agitate for a political solution to this problem, because ultimately it's going to be policy which decides whether we continue to allow this going on or not.
So, Tom, talk about the genesis of your book, and also I suppose one of the things I think is so amazing about what I've read so far is the sprawling scope of what you're describing. This is a, you know, it's a, I mean, I don't know if you call it, it's not even international, it's a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think, well, first of all, it's absolutely a delight to be here with everyone, and you're right to salute Misha for blazing this trail so long before everybody else. I think there was a moment when, long before I ever thought of writing this book, or even the previous book, when I was the FT correspondent in Southern Africa, 2008 this was, and that's when I became aware of something that I suppose we could call sort of City of London speak, or city speak. And I think that's absolutely essential to what we're trying to understand tonight, is the power of obfuscation and the power of essentially bullshit to allow, business bullshit to allow enormous criminal activity to go on through London. I went back, and I'm going to treat you to a brief extract from the market statement, the London Stock Exchange statement I read on 11th of April 2008 when I was down in Joburg, that really alerted me to this role of London as the sort of clearinghouse for kleptocracy. So it begins, and just bear with me for a second. Kamek, the fully integrated exploration, mining and production company, announces that it has entered into an agreement to acquire an interest in platinum mining assets in Zimbabwe via the acquisition of 100% of Lefevre Finance Limited, a British Virgin Islands company. So on and so forth about the platinum that's under Zimbabwe and how much money this is going to make everybody. And then this. The purchase consideration is a cash payment of US finance from the company's existing cash balances and the issue of 250 million new Kamek shares. Kamek has agreed to advance Lefevre an amount of $100 million by way of a loan to enable Lefevre to comply with its contractual obligations to the government of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Merriweather Investments Limited, the seller of the shares in Lefevre, will on completion of the transaction hold a 13.07% stake in the enlarged capital of Kamek. And then there's stuff about this being a time of significant opportunity in Zimbabwe. every single day in London, the stock exchange is flooded with statements like this, some more nefarious than others. What this actually is saying, what's remarkable about it is that there are no human beings mentioned there at all. There are two shell companies, two front companies, Lefebvre and Merryweather. They actually sound quite sort of comforting. Merryweather especially sounds like a sort of jolly pub. And what was actually going on there was that Robert Mugabe was about to lose an election. He shook down one mining house, got hold of a platinum asset. He gave it to one of his cronies, a guy called Billy Rautenbach, who had spent a long time involved in pillaging Congo. Rautenbach is Merryweather. He hides behind that company. Then he takes that, Billy Rautenbach takes his platinum mine, sells it to a London Stock Exchange company in which our pensions and the rest of it are invested. The upshot is that $100 million passes to Robert Mugabe just when he's about to lose power. It's all in there, but just translated into bullshit, so that all the money machine can keep spinning. The actual human reality is that Mugabe receives $100 million when he's about to lose power. And then he has the war chest to embark on one of the most brutal election thefts we've seen anywhere for a long time, literally beating to death people suspected of voting for the opposition candidate, pulls out, Mugabe retains power for another decade, and then is succeeded by someone from his regime. I looked up earlier as well what the life expectancy was in Zimbabwe in 2008 when this happened, and it was 46.5 years. So this sequence of dodgy deals dressed up in bullshit means that everyone in Zimbabwe has spent an additional quarter of their lives and counting under one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. And it's all facilitated through London, and it's all facilitated simply by the existence of front companies. There's all manner of complexity supplied by the various former bits of the British Empire and the Caribbean and the Channel and so on. And the industry, Oliver, you use this term in Moneyland, the industry of de-embarrassing money, which I think is brilliant. These are all sort of the supply chain of a type of trust company or a type of dummy director or whatever it may be, assembled in London to allow powerful, corrupt people to wield money anonymously. And that's what it all boils down to, is the ability of people to use the facilities of the city to disguise their nefarious activities.
So, I mean, I love that this is the provision of bullshit, right? This is just, dressing up mafia activities in legalistic bullshit to make it look good. Anneliese, as Misha said, I mean, certainly since McMafia came out, and then we've got a couple of great questions from Ed Lucas. A lot of the work that Ed Lucas did in The Economist and other journalists have done. Obviously, Catherine Belton, fantastic book about Putin, came out. Putin's People, everyone read it. Anneliese, everyone knows this is happening. This is what's so terrifying. So why is it proving so difficult to do something about this? I mean, you're, there, as it were, in the cockpit, seeing what's going on. Why is this being so difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good and very frustrating question because, I'm not saying that there's one silver bullet, but there are a range of different mechanisms to effectively remove those legitimizing covers that have just been described. It's not complete rocket science how we can get a grip on this. I'm not saying that then other loopholes wouldn't be looked for, but ultimately, I mean, some of the really egregious failings that there are in the system, as you say, they've been known about for a very, very long time. I mean, I've quoted in Parliament, I think wasn't it yourself, Oliver, you set up that company called Crook Limited. I've quoted that in Parliament and said this is clearly revealing that the company registration system is not effective. When you can have that, you can have 2-year-olds as company directors. It's an absolute farce. Now, last week, finally, we had some indications of how government may be seeking to reform that process, and that's good. At least they've released some suggestions around what's going to happen there. they've got to find parliamentary time for it. Now, we've been, and please, before anyone jumps on me and says that public toilets are important, my goodness, I know they are, but we've been talking about the taxation of public toilets in the House of Commons. We can talk about this surely and find the parliamentary time to actually get these measures through. On the register of property ownership, you know, we as the opposition, and, you know, there were Conservative members saying this as well, I'm not, you know, it's not a party political thing. We said, look, you don't need to go through the normal mechanisms to get this through. You know, just speed it up, get that register in place. We're not going to stand in the way of it, but it's still not happened. You know, I was calling on government again last weekend to do that. And you know, so much else that needs to change. I mean, all the limited partnership structures that are still there that we know are used to hide money. I mean, maybe we need to look at what the arguments are that are used to rebuff change. I very often have, you know, I'm often told, oh, it's very, very complicated, you know, with the insinuation that people don't understand business who are calling for change here. Well, as I said, this is not about preventing legitimate business, quite the opposite. And in fact, ordinary businesses are often the ones that really suffer because of this kind of behaviour. So that's just kind of obfuscation. I think we often have the use of jargon to try and hide things. Then I think sometimes also it's the fact that, you know, these are areas of public policy that don't often receive a lot of scrutiny. I mean, I know it's not exactly the same point, but we've had the only vote ever on a tax treaty in the House of Commons. I think it was over a year ago now, when I called for one, when I actually read through the new treaty and saw that it was going to massively reduce Lesotho's ability to tax UK-owned diamond companies. And so I said, right, we've got to have a vote on this. It's the first time that it ever happened, from what I understand it, in the UK Parliament. So it's partly that this isn't something that traditionally, I guess, MPs have necessarily got that involved in. Now, I thought that might change with the Russia report. Arguably, it's changed around some aspects of the broad context. So the fact that we did get the what's often called the Magnitsky rules through around sanctions hasn't yet had the bite that we want it to. But, you know, that has now gone through. So we can sometimes get change. You know, there's a particularly strong foreign, I suppose, foreign policy angle there. But yes, it's occurring far too slowly for my liking. And ultimately, what this is about, you know, I'm really strongly agreed with Misha and Tom here. This is about effectively resources being stolen from often people who have very, very little to call their own. That's what this is about a lot of the time. And we should not be allowing our country's name to be sullied through it any longer.
I'm just wondering how sort of brutal the electoral calculus is here. I mean, people in Zimbabwe who've had their platinum resources stolen, they don't get to vote in the UK, but the lawyers who get to, you know, set up the shell companies and move the funds around do get to vote in the UK. Is that how crude it is, essentially, that if there is a lobbying operation, it's working in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there certainly is an influence from lobbying generally. I mean, I would argue, I mean, others might not totally agree with this, and it wasn't perfect, but with the new anti-money laundering directive, where we'd push strongly for transparency around trusts, the fact that in the UK we're going to have, you know, the toughest possible barriers for journalists to get through in order to be able to then look at that data. I'm pretty sure that's come about because of lobbying and claims being made that every, you know, I mean, it's slightly ridiculous, some of this, but, you know, I've had people saying to me, oh, but, you know, think of that trust where there's a child who really needs support from the trust, and they'll be just appallingly exploited if there's any information about them, you know, released into the public realm. That is, you know, a kind of minority of cases, and anyway, there are ways to protect them. You know, it's all these kind of spurious arguments are thrown around all the time. But anyway, I'm sure that some of that lobbying, of course, it will influence this area when there is an absence of a counterbalance. I mean, I think groups like Transparency International do a very, very good job pushing in the other direction, I would say. But particularly when it's more technical, actually kind of upping the ante on this can be quite a challenge, I would say. So maybe that's part of the reason.
There's a question coming from Ed Lucas, which I think it might be interesting for you to address, Tom, about the use of legal intimidation to shut down journalists trying to write about this. Obviously, if we can't write about it, it's difficult for politicians to find out about it and therefore to make it a priority. In writing Kleptopia and also, I mean, your series in the FT, how much difficulty did you have getting that lawyered? I mean, this is a journalism club, so I think we can be, a little bit, inside baseball about this.
Yes, well, it was quite something. The legal process with the book, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's essentially 4 stories from the world of kleptocracy. So from the former Soviet Union, from Africa, and then feeding through London and Washington all the way up to Donald himself. And when it just so happened that when lockdown started was exactly the moment we were going through the process of writing lots of letters to all the people in the book saying, you're going to be in this book, these are the facts, are any of them incorrect, would you like to correct anything that I'm going to say in the book? And I would like to think that I, through that process, made a decent contribution to a stimulus package for our poor, beleaguered libel lawyers of the city through this difficult time. And they together, Shillings, Carter Ruck, and the rest of them, they sent me 200,000 words of legal correspondence. So essentially twice the length of the book. A lot of it pretty menacing. Billy Rautenbach's lawyers, the guy I mentioned earlier, the Mugabe crony, he works with, he retains a law firm in Johannesburg, and they sent me an extraordinary letter that was talking about it's ironic, I thought, threatening me with the full might of the law and saying that I should realize that criminal defamation laws are still in place in places where I may find myself, Southern Africa, where I do often find myself, which is essentially a threat to get me arrested. And then there are more sort of legalistic threats of all manner of libel and breach of confidence proceedings. I think there are all manner of aspects of this. Ed Lucas is very interesting on this. And I think one important thing to raise, especially for a journalism club, is how, and I'm sure others will have detected this, for a long time it was, you go after a rich villain and they threaten libel proceedings, and they, the Jonathan Aitken would be a good example, and eventually the truth comes out. What's changing, it seems to me, is that it's a bit harder to sue for libel in London now, since the scandal over kind of libel tourism and oligarchs shutting down legitimate journalistic scrutiny. So increasingly the route seems to be people trying to use confidentiality laws and privacy laws. I've had a few skirmishes like this, and in fact the trio who are in the book, the 3 Central Asian oligarchs who are under investigation by the SFO, they've made a strange filing in New York, public filing, accusing me of being part of some big conspiracy against them, but also trying to push the argument that I've in some way violated their confidentiality. So not even really addressing the facts at all, just essentially saying, you don't have the right about this stuff because rich people have a special right to secrecy. And I think that is the new trend in London, which remains sadly the sort of global capital of expensively shutting journalists up, is a shift to use confidentiality laws.
So, Misha, there's a good question come in from an anonymous attendee, which is sort of ironic in the circumstances, about, so what are the NCA doing? We have some, I'd say the laws we have in place are pretty good in terms of, for recovery of assets, unexplained wealth orders and so on. We've got some new and very powerful tools available, and yet very little happens. So, what's stopping the National Crime Agency or the Met or City of London Police or the Serious Fraud Office from getting their grips into what's going on?
The different agencies have different challenges, although essentially the primary challenge is lack of resources. The NCA has, in the past 18 months, really tried to place a greater emphasis on tackling economic crime. Part of the reason for the difficulties they face is these are very, very expensive, complicated cases to investigate and then prosecute. So since the unexplained wealth orders came in, for example, the McMafia law, as it's called, the problem with that is it takes months and months and months to build a case, and then you have to go through the process of negotiating with the person who's investigated by this, because as we saw recently with the most recent case, is that they can just sort of say, okay, I've done it, it's a fair cop, and here's the £10 million, but they get away without any criminal conviction, which, as far as the NCA is concerned, is a difficult thing to swallow. So they have the problem of resources. They also have the real difficulties with the nature of money laundering, how it takes place, and so on. And one of the big problems that we have is with the banks, and this is why I think the FinCEN leaks were so important, because until something emerges out of a bank, as it were, it's very, very difficult for law enforcement to investigate what is going on in a bank. So if you take the case of Danske Bank, for example, which is the last one that I looked at in some detail, this was quite extraordinary how what is the major financial institution of Denmark, when it took over the Estonian branch, Sampo Bank, which turned into the problem for it, it was actually alerted by the Central Bank of Russia that the Russians suspected that this was being used as a money laundering center. They ignored that. Then every bank which is not an American bank has to get a license to deal in dollars. And to do that, you have to work with an American-based bank, a so-called correspondent bank. And they were actually withdrawn from the correspondence relationship by JP Morgan, their corresponding bank, in 2013. In 2014, if I've got my time right, it might have been the other way around, they had an internal whistleblower saying, this stinks to high heaven. Now, huge sums of money were being laundered through Estonia, the Estonian branch, much of it going through the United Kingdom, incidentally. Of course, the UK was saying at the time, well, you know, this is nothing to do with us. This is an Estonian problem, or it's a Danish problem. And this speaks to the complexity. When Tom said that his book is about 4 stories, what's really important about these 4 apparently entirely separate stories is that they are linked through institutions, they are linked through networks, and they actually make you know, a story in totality. But each of the constituent parts can say, well, it's not to do with us because it's to do with that other part, which is what happened in the case of Danske Bank. So although people were aware of something very rotten being in the state of Denmark from about 2012, 2013 onwards, it still took another 4 years for the board and the executives of Danske Bank to say, okay, well, actually we'll resign. Of course, no criminal charges are brought against them, just as in 2008, after the really you know, egregious financial crimes committed by banks all over the world. They remain essentially immune to prosecution. And this is a key thing in legislation, that until there is responsibility, just as with the Magnitsky Act in terms of criminal responsibility for not complying with their obligations, it's going to be very, very hard for law enforcement to really get anywhere.
Ollie, can I just add something very quick, briefly?
Definitely.
Because it also goes to what Anneliese was saying earlier about the rule of law. That the UK's greatest strength is also its weakness here. That the ancient tradition of the rule of law is what attracts dirty money, and we often think that means, you know, someone can squirrel away the proceeds of a dodgy contract and buy a big house, and a dictator won't be able to just take it back off them. But I think there's something more fundamental to it too, and Misha alluded to it, and Anneliese as well earlier. What I hear is that one of the perhaps the most dangerous upshot of the under-resourcing of financial crime law enforcement, so the NTA and the SFO, which is extreme. So, you know, that a couple of oligarchs make in a fortnight the SFO's annual budget of £50 million. As a result, you've got a lot of very brilliant people at the SFO and the NTA, a lot of them, but hopelessly under-resourced, to the point that they have no time or resources to go pursuing new cases particularly. They're just swamped with the old ones. So the way you get the NCA or the SFO to pick up a case is you take it into them. But who are the people taking it into them? It's private intelligence agencies working for some guy's enemy. So if you are a member of some big faction in Ukraine or Nigeria or Kazakhstan, you come to London, you go to Mayfair, you hire one of the big private intelligence agencies, you say, do a job on my big rival for the presidential succession or for the oil ministry or whatever it may be. Then take that file and give it to the hopelessly overstretched guy who's working for a pittance compared to his private sector counterparts at the SFO, deliver that and let the UK justice system take down, do your sort of kleptocratic political dirty work for you. That's, people I think are really worried that that is going to fill the vacuum created by the lack of resources to do kind of original, independent work.
I would say my in terms of lack of resources, something I'd noticed kind of amazing after the FinCEN leaks, that there were 400 journalists working on those 2,000 suspicious activity reports. The staff of FinCEN and the UK Financial Intelligence Unit put together is just over 400. And between them, they have to look at 2.5 million SARs every year. It's just absolutely incredible. It's a disgrace, to be honest. Tom, quickly, a question from Graham Barrow, the company's house whisperer, legendary host of the Dark Money Files podcast. We in the UK, we got a pretty clean bill of health from the FATF, the G7's Financial Action Task Force, saying that we were great. Is that more, I mean, does that make the job even harder? Because then people can just hold that up and say, we're fine.
Yeah, I mean, it does, doesn't it? But also I think we're talking, you were asking Anneliese earlier about the question of political will. And I honestly don't think that outside a very small group of people, anyone, your average punter finds the FATF and everything about it utterly bewildering and uninteresting. And the only way to, and even nonetheless, I think them giving the UK sort of relatively clean bill of health is a shame, because it removes one potential lever of pressure. But far more likely to defer to Anneliese, who's an actual politician and knows about these things. But it seems to me that people only care about things when they affect their own safety and well-being. And you can go back to the opening pages of McMafia and tragic death caused by the spread of dirty money. And in my book, I try to really get to the real human cost. So the massacre in the Kazakh steppe, or the witnesses in a corruption case who keep turning up dead, the Russian dissident shot one night on a bridge, and so on. And I think, in a way, a parallel is climate change, isn't it? That it was an esoteric scientific debate for a long time, and then people's homes started going underwater, people's communities started being ravaged by wildfires and ever more damaging weather. Refugees were leaving Chad and elsewhere because their climate was making their homes uninhabitable. And I feel like it's that kind of shift, far more than a radical shift towards extreme openness with money. You know, we were talking earlier about, Anneliese made a very good point of the argument she hears against financial transparency about, you know, there's always a case of some kid who might be exposed. I wrote a piece for Open Democracy the other day about this, saying that argument is it's the argument of the people who say, well, I should be allowed to drive 150 miles an hour on the motorway because I've got something very important to do. We have rules, we have strict liability about speeding, taxations, and various other things where we say, for the greater good, there is a simple rule. You can't do this. You can't speed. You can't not declare your income. We could simply say, you can't do business with a company with an anonymous owner. And lots of people would say there are problems with that. But the financial secrecy industry, right back to the Swiss bankers who pushed this nonsense Jewish money from the Nazis, which has been totally debunked and continues to be pushed. Right from then up until now, there are bleeding heart arguments in favor of financial secrecy, and we have to cut through that by looking at the massive human cost of this continued secrecy.
So, Anneliese, you're a politician here, as Tom's pointed out. How are we going to do this? You know, if you become chancellor at the next election, and which will be whenever it is, 2024 or something, what would be, you know, I appreciate you'll have a lot of priorities that aren't necessarily only this, but if you know, were to be able to get stuck into this, what would be the kind of measures you'd be hoping to be able to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole programme really of interventions that are necessary, that are evidence-based, that have been advocated for a long time. Actually, in some cases that are even accepted by government as necessary, but we're not seeing them being implemented, and it's taking an extraordinarily long time. I mean, we talked a little bit about a few of them, I suppose, already. The fact that we do need to have that transparency there around property ownership. We need to have it also, particularly when it's foreign-owned property ownership. We need to have it, of course, around trusts as well, and have, you know, a proper thoroughgoing implementation of that anti-money laundering directive that actually lives up to what was passed rather than a really measly interpretation of it. We need to have really quite basic things changed in Companies House. You know, the fact that there aren't going to drop down menus that prevent you from putting in obviously invalid information. You know, really quite basic things that aren't very resource intensive. I think we also need to see action, pretty obviously, we've not talked about this very much this evening, but in relation to our overseas territories and crown dependencies, and you know, I have a lot of discussions with those involved in governance in those jurisdictions. And I think that actually there are a variety of views within those jurisdictions. There are those who are pretty fed up with the current situation and want there to be transparency and want to have, you know, more sustainable and varied economies, actually, a lot of the time, that aren't so dependent on secrecy in a number of cases. So we need to have that change. And I think there are ways to do it in a way that's respectful to those jurisdictions, but which gets that change. We need to actually, I mean, we've had the consultation on a failure to prevent economic crime offence. We had it months and months and months ago, but we still don't have any plan for legislative change around that. And I think that is necessary. I really agree with what Misha said around that about responsibility there. I mean, there are longer term issues that will need to be got a grip on. The fact that there's a really complicated regulatory landscape here. I think there's is it 26 bodies that have got some responsibilities around money laundering that now come under OPBAS, if I've given that acronym right, which was meant to bring them all together. You know, still doesn't really work very well. Unfortunately, some of them kind of war with each other, like, you know, some of the different ones representing lawyers, etc. You know, they've got very different perspectives. So that will be difficult to be got, you know, running better, those kind of complicated issues. I agree with what was said around resourcing. But ultimately, you know, what's got to drive this? I think we've got to say that principle of transparency is really, really important, because, you know, even if we do get to a situation where we've got those bodies with direct jurisdiction around this, whether we're talking about the SFO or the NCA or others, they will only ever have a limited bandwidth. So we do need to make sure that that sunlight of scrutiny is available, so that we can, so that journalists can, I'm not just saying this because I'm, here amongst journalists, but so that those kinds of leads can be investigated ultimately. So transparency is very, very important here. And, we see that we need it in other areas, and yet for whatever reason, it's excluded when we're talking about financial and company ownership matters. And I'd just say finally, I talk to a lot of investors, as you'd anticipate, and I always come back to this because so often it's used as a reason for not acting. This is something that will be good for the UK's economy. It will be positive for our economy to deal with these problems. It will root out those who undermine others ultimately, so that there's no excuse for not moving ahead.
Ollie, can I just come in there on the...
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a specific question, and then you can take it in any direction you want, Misha.
Yeah.
So just because Martin Woods, the whistleblower, is on the meeting, how do you feel about paying whistleblowers, Misha?
About paying whistleblowers?
Yeah. Like they do in America.
I would be dubious about that. What I do think is that whistleblowers need to be protected, which is really the problem that whistleblowers face. Is that too often they get blowback. That was the case with Graham Wilkinson in the Danske Bank case, for example, and many others. I mean, just open any copy of Private Eye, and there'll be another story about here in the United Kingdom or elsewhere where a whistleblower faces very severe personal consequences for having taken that difficult, very difficult step. And there are a lot of whistleblowers, well, they're not whistleblowers, there are a lot of people I've spoken to in companies who have very damaging information, but are simply too frightened to do it. And that's in part because they don't get the protection. The idea of incentivizing them with money, I don't think is a good one for a whole set of reasons. But I did want to pick up on what Anneliese was saying about the transparency registers. This is a really, really central thing, and ironically, perhaps to people's surprise, the Prime Minister who did most to try and establish transparency registers was David Cameron. Unfortunately, he started this initiative in early 2016.
What happened to him?
and as soon as the referendum result came through, then the initiative, which was a good initiative, it wasn't so much derailed as it just got completely bogged down in all the stuff around Brexit subsequent to 2016. And Theresa May, without questions, she slowed down this whole process. Now, the one bit of the process which did go through was the overseas territories, and it's worth pointing out that the British Virgin Islands last week finally agreed to a public register, and this is an important step forward. But really, we need the public register that not merely law enforcement, but the public themselves can access in this country. And what Theresa May did when she came in was essentially to say, oh, well, we need to have another commission to look at this. We've had about 3 commissions looking into this already. It's a classic sort of stalling tactic. At the moment, we are supposed to get this by, I think the last date was 2023. That may have changed since I last looked at this a few months ago. But really, this is absolutely central so that you can know who is behind any company. Who is the person? We need to have that person before you can attribute responsibility for certain activities. And there is absolutely no excuse for this not being standard practice, not just in this country, but around the world.
So, Tom, Misha mentioned the referendum. I suppose we'd all hope that the direction of travel travel, you know, as with after your book and Catherine Belton's book and all the other books going back to McMafia, and Nick Shaxson's book, of course, I haven't mentioned Nick tonight. Treasure Island's a very good book. Everyone should read it if you haven't already. In fact, read it again. The referendum, I suppose the concern is the direction of travel is towards, you know, if it's towards Singapore on Thames, in inverted commas, and I don't think they mean that in the social housing sense. I think they mean that in the deregulation sense. You know, how do we try, I mean, is that a worry that you have that actually everything's going to get worse?
Yes, it is. I would say that when it comes to politics, so much of this work is just to try to see where interests are becoming aligned and where, you know, we talk about dirty money seeking the haven of real estate or art, or, you know, you can launder your money and your children at the same time and spend your money on private school fees or whatever it may be. But you know, perhaps the biggest investment is to buy political favor. And I would say that's when we get into the most murky and dangerous area. If you look back at there are big questions about the funding of the Vote Leave campaign. There are big questions now about the allocation of COVID contracts to people connected to the Vote Leave campaign and to Boris Johnson's circle. I've sat in the office of a Russian who openly says that he had connections to the intelligence services and has on his wall Boris Johnson's whiff-waff bats, ping pong to the rest of us, which he bought at a Conservative Party function. You know, there are major donors to Boris's personal campaigns and to the Conservative Party. There are also obviously dubious donors to the Labour Party, but those in power at the moment have an astonishing proclivity for Kremlin-connected political donors. Can you imagine if that was the other way around? And the three main donors to Vladimir Putin's political campaigns were British tycoons. I imagine the Russian political elite would think that was pretty odd and probably quite a bad thing. And I don't think it's just, you know, dive into conspiracy theories to say that the more money that comes into British politics, more or less directly from the world's most powerful kleptocracies, the more likely British politicians are to behave in a way that helps dirty money stay secret rather than, as Anneliese says, lets in the sunshine.
Yes, and around just to reinforce that, what happened with the Russia report of the Intelligence Committee is really quite astonishing. The idea that it can just be, first of all, it can be, you know, blocked and blocked and blocked because there's an election coming on. But then when the Select Committee demands that because there is sufficient evidence, we really have to look at what went on around the Brexit referendum. And remember, this is, you know, it's a multi-party committee. The fact that this was just sort of, you know, brushed aside as totally unimportant, irrelevant, old hat, and so on and so forth, it was astonishing. And if I was a member of the Select Committee, the Intelligence Committee, I would feel really not just insulted, but also I would consider that this government is really not interested in finding out what is going on. And you can't help but come to the conclusion of what are they hiding?
Anneliese, do you think it's possible to actually arrange that for Misha to be a member of the Intelligence? Very helpful.
We do actually have someone who gave evidence to the Russian report here, and he put his hand up. Can I, Ed? Do you feel like telling us a little bit? Do you have a response to what Misha just said? This is Ed Lucas.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Ed.
Yes, we've got you.
Well, I think Misha's, I mean, I agree with almost everything that everybody said. And I think that, I mean, there was several scandals. It was a scandal that it took so long for the Intelligence and Security Committee actually to get going on the report because they faced systematic obstruction from Downing Street. Then it was a scandal that the intelligence and security agencies didn't cooperate fully. And there's some some of that's leaked into the, or is evident from the public, the redacted version of the report, and it's clear that our agencies were asleep on the job when it came to Russian political protection of our political system. And then there's the scandal that it was so late in being released because they didn't want this to become an election issue back in December. And then the final scandal is that now it has come out, nobody's doing anything about it. So that's already 4, and that's pretty bad. But I think that this is such a broad problem. It's easier to go for the sort of bright, shiny thing. And the bright, shiny thing is the ISC report, because it's kind of secret and intelligence and so on. But where we're really losing is in the weeds. And so I really want to just ask Anneliese, can we revisit, for example, the question of whether limited liability for companies? Limited liability is a privilege. It allows you to go bankrupt, and you personally don't go bankrupt. It's just your company goes bankrupt. And that was a great idea for setting up sort of adventures overseas back in the 18th century, this idea of the joint stock company. It was never conceived as a way of concealing your identity. We never had a vote on that, never before Parliament. It just sort of somehow crept up on us that you could have a limited liability company and also conceal your identity. So one thing that the next Labour government, if we ever get it, could do would be to say, look, you can choose. If you want limited liability, you have to be real people, or quoted on a stock exchange with lots of real shareholders. If you want to be anonymous, that's fine, but then you are liable for every penny of every debt. And then let's see who wants to do business with you. And the answer will be nobody.
There you go, Anneliese, putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question. It is one that I'm interested in, actually. And Prem Sikka, who's done quite a lot of work on different forms of money laundering and other activities, he's kind of looked into this. And you're right, I think that use of limited partnership is kind of gone well beyond what was initially anticipated to be used for. I mean, we have seen around Scottish limited partnerships, English limited partnerships, much more of a focus. I mean, there's had to be because of their misuse by particularly those coming from Russia and nearby countries, and pretty widespread evidence of misuse there. But that hasn't then led to a broader questioning of the form of limited partnership. I mean, it is very embedded in corporate structures that are used very routinely now. I think particularly around things like accountancy and audit. It could be questioned whether that would lead to quite a lot of those auditors saying, well, I'm not going to be willing to keep doing audit anymore if all the liability is going to be on me directly. So a very radical change could be quite difficult to achieve. But do we need to look at the misuse of these forms? Well, absolutely. And I think certainly the case for SLPs, ELPs is very, very clear cut, and we've not seen enough change yet.
Anneliese, we have to leave you. You have to leave us at 7, don't you? Can I just ask you very quickly? Tom did ask a couple of questions, raised interesting points about politics and the potentially corrupting influence of very large donations from murky origins. Is that something that you guys are concerned about as well? And would that be something that you would think about looking at?
I mean, it is concerning that we're meant to have a strong regulatory regime with clear declaration of donations. I suppose that some of the recent cases that have come out, they were declared, but then obviously there's been links into some of the investigations that have gone on recently. I mean, I've probably got to be quite careful what I say here legally myself. I don't want to kind of say anything that isn't 110% true. But, am I concerned about some of what we've seen over recent years? Absolutely, I am. I'm very concerned about it. I think it does suggest that those who don't have a commitment to, let's be honest, a rules-based international regime, those who want to move away from that, have been trying to use a whole range of mechanisms to move away from that, and potentially financial influence as well. But whenever I talk on those kinds of matters, I need to make sure that I've got very strong evidence behind me, because that, well, I suppose related to some of what we've been talking about, is often when people don't have that strong, or not even strong evidence, but where they're not, I suppose, fully lawyered, to use Tom's phrase, that they can get in trouble as a result of it, which is unfortunate, because we shouldn't be in that kind of a situation. But I think it's the reality we face right now.
Okay, well, listen, we've been talking for an hour. I think we're going to leave it. Thank you very much. Tom's book, yay to HarperCollins for going ahead with it despite the legal threats. Thanks, yay to Tom for being here. Thanks, Misha. Thanks, Anneliese. And we will be back. Hopefully the next Kleptoscope will be in real life, and then that will be great fun and we can all have a drink afterwards. Thanks very much for joining us.